Hi, friends. Beth Basham here. I am CEO, I guess, of Healthy by Design RD, and here to give you guys a nice review of carb cravings. I've heard this come up a lot in conversations I've had with personal clients. I've had questions come up around carb cravings with clients of my past, and we've had I've generated a little discussion in this group around it, asking you guys if you wanted some more information about how we can apply mindful and intuitive eating practices to help support carb cravings. So I'm going to dive into that. I'm excited about this topic because I think it's really valuable, especially for women who are constantly trying to watch carbs, right? That's really the macronutrient of concern these days is carbs. Oh, if I remove carbs, I lose weight. If I remove carbs, I feel better. If I remove carbs, insert result, right? So I want to talk a little bit about the science behind that, just to give you guys some ideas around where this comes from. Talk about diet culture's impact on our belief that carbs are bad. And then I want to talk about some solutions and how we can actually use mindful and intuitive eating to support progress in this area, right? Because it's really important. This is an important topic. So if you're able to watch the recording or you're able to pop on live, feel free to add your comments, type in replay if you're watching this for the first time after the recording has been posted to the group. I would love to see who is following this post, who's interested in this topic. So again, I can continue to create content that supports your progress on your mindful and intuitive eating journey. So let's jump into a little bit of the research first behind carbohydrates and this whole idea about carb restriction. Because again, I've heard from so many clients, this is the macronutrient of concern when they're trying to reach a goal, whether that's weight loss or gut health or generally feeling better. The first thing that comes to mind for a lot of women is that I need to remove carbs. And you might know that there's a little difference. There's different types of carbs, right? There's more refined carbohydrates, things that have more sugar in them. Sugar is a carbohydrate as well. Things like donuts or cupcakes or ice cream, you might think of those as quote unquote bad carbs. And then you think of more complex carbohydrates, which include things like fruits and vegetables and whole grains and things like that have been deemed more healthy carbs, right? And so sometimes when people are thinking about carb restriction, they don't necessarily consider complex carbohydrates the issue. They're more about the refined sugary carbs. So I want to talk a little bit about that today too. And again, at the end, give you guys some tools for how to go about and help really support if you're feeling you have strong carb cravings or this quote unquote addiction to sugar, which I want to also bring up as a mistruth from the diet culture and talk about some evidence behind addiction with food. It doesn't exist, and I'm going to explain why. So let's jump into it. I took some notes, so you're going to see me looking down at my paper just because I want to make sure I don't miss anything. So the first thing I just want to address is that in studies and research, when we find addictive qualities in rats or humans, it's usually as a result of feeling restricted or feeling deprived of a particular thing. So in the research done, there's actually zero evidence, okay, that particular foods are addictive. And I want to highlight carbs and sugar as the topic of interest today, since that's what we're talking about. So I want to start to break down this misnomer that there's this thing called food addiction. Now, I don't want to take away from the real lived experience that you might have had around feeling maybe uncontrolled around carbohydrate containing foods, specifically sugar. But I also, again, want to give you some solutions on how to conquer that. So there's zero evidence that foods are addictive, but research does suggest that when we restrict a particular food, okay, let's just talk carbs and sugar right now, it does amplify the food's saliency. Saliency is just a fancy word for yumminess or like being attracted to the food. So if you think about how diet culture infiltrates this, telling us messages, carbs are bad, sugar is bad, you shouldn't eat this. Sugar triggers the same chemical in the brain as cocaine. Going to get to that in a second. We get really fearful around foods. We start to restrict them, carbs in this particular case, sugar in this particular case. And what that actually does from a psychological standpoint is it actually makes those foods look even more yummy and attractive than ever. And I know I experienced this when I was thick into diet culture, dieting myself, restricting against my body. So this is important to kind of start to recognize, to tap in and be like, what beliefs or what messages have I been told about carbohydrates, and are they true? And has that impacted my sense of restriction or deprivation around carbohydrates in general to start? Okay, because just that restrictive deprivation of a particular food group actually increases its attractiveness, its yumminess. Okay, so food addiction also is being used in different circles as this reason for people having larger bodies or gaining weight. Okay, I'm addicted to sugar, therefore I've gained 50 pounds, or I'm addicted, and that's actually really bad science. And that's a theory that's really fueled by weight stigma and fat phobia in our country. So I just really want to, because food addiction is not the same as drug or alcohol addiction. So it's really important to address that's not a reason why we have as a culture or a person has gained weight or something like that. Okay, that's actually really, really rooted in not great science, A. And then B, it's again fueled and perpetuated by the diet culture and the diet industry as a reason, like you have something quote unquote wrong with you, and that's why you are looking the way you look or whatever, which is just it makes me cringe, and it should make you cringe too, because those messages are very harmful and very fear-based. Okay, so, and if we look at research, there's a research study done on rodents, and they do show that the rodents eat sugary type things in an addictive way when they have intermittent or restricted access to it. Okay, so it's not until the particular food is restricted or intermittently offered that the rat kind of goes crazy. Now, I like to think about this from an evolutionary perspective. If we were in a particular time of history where we had feast or famine, right? Our evolutionary biology drove us to eat a lot of a food when it was available, right? Because it wasn't always available. So maybe we had a harvest of fruit, right? Of fruit or potatoes or something, and they're only good for so long, right? Especially fruits that go bad or more perishable. So we would gorge ourselves, not in a bad way. We would eat a lot of those foods. And one could say, oh, you're addicted to the sweet fruits, but really it was a source of survival, right? In a period of time that there was maybe limited or intermittent access to a particular food, right? By the way, if you're watching live, please say hello. I'd love to see who's here. I just see a little eyeball with a number next to it. But if you have any comments or questions as I'm talking today, please feel free to chime those into the chat box. Okay, and this also explains why certain areas of our brains are lighted up when we have, and actually this is another rat study, but there's this whole misnomer out there that, oh, sugar is as addictive as cocaine. And I'll be the first to admit, when I saw those headlines years ago, I was like, oh my gosh, this explains this issue and this issue with my patient and whatever. Like, if sugar is triggering the same area of the brain as cocaine, well, no wonder we have so many issues with it, right? As a population, as a person. I mean, who doesn't have a sweet tooth to a degree? And I was like, this explains everything. But we have to be very careful with that information. That headline is very, very rooted in fear. It's a fear-based. Any headlines that are fear-based, I always question. But I also want to mention the research behind it, because in the study where they determined that this was the truth, the rats that were having their brains stimulated in the same way that cocaine stimulated the brain were also being deprived of that particular food, right? They were being deprived of the sugary food, right? So again, it leads to what my first point was, that actually deprivation and restriction led to higher saliency, which is just a fancy word for yumminess or an attractiveness of food. And that's when it triggered the same response in the body. Not to mention, the other difference that's really important to understand with this research is that when you go into a fast, those that response in the brain actually goes away. Unfortunately, with drug addiction, particularly cocaine, it doesn't just go away when you take away the cocaine, right? There's actually like a truly addictive quality to that kind of drug that is not seen with any particular food. And you can go into deeper research. I actually uh, posted a great article from another dietitian in another thread on this group that you can always go back and read. I thought it was really well done. In fact, I drew some of my points from this article because I thought it was just very clean the way that she had it written out. But I find that, if we are informed of this information, it actually gives us some power over how we want to talk about carb cravings, right? So the first thing to note, well, actually, maybe it's the second or third thing to note, is that let's examine whether or not carb cravings, why they exist, and is it because of a culture that perpetuates carbs is bad, and that badness leads us to restrict and deprive precious carbs, sugar, everything from simple carbs to complex carbs. Therefore, we have an increased interest in those foods because we deprive ourselves of those things on a regular basis. Okay. I noticed this just as an example. I mean, I definitely experienced this myself. Like, I remember, like, I didn't feel like I could trust myself around cookies or donuts or something that a coworker brought in, cake, because 95% of the time I didn't allow myself to eat those foods, right? At home, I kept a very strict pantry with this, and this. My fridge had certain things. So when I got around sugar, I felt very uncontrolled around it. And I felt like I couldn't trust myself with that food, and I would overeat it and overconsume it as a result. And somebody could misconstrue this as, oh, I have an addiction to sugar, when in fact it was actually more related to a long-term deprivation and restriction that was imposed by diet culture and my saturation in that. So, again, this is not, I don't want to be dismissive of anybody's true experience around this stuff, because it is real. It does feel really difficult when we feel like we can't trust ourselves around a particular food group, whether it be carbohydrates or sugar or you name it. Okay. I hope that kind of helps you understand some of the science behind this. Now, this is not, also, I want to make just a strong disclaimer here. This is not me promoting, oh, you need to go out and eat a whole bunch of donuts or whatever it is, that food you've been restricting, but in some ways it actually is. So I'm going to get into the solution for this as a way to, again, prime your mindful and intuitive eating brain, turn that on, that awareness and that curiosity to really start to recognize the science behind it, just to give you guys that preview. But also, let's talk about how we can actually start to move through this and how to find, quote unquote, balance within our own bodies, which, again, balance is going to look different for every one of us. So I want you to ask yourself really, really genuinely right now, do you intentionally restrict carbohydrates because of something that you've learned or read? Or do you restrict carbohydrates because it's something that your body's told you? Okay, there's actually a very strong difference there. So starting to differentiate and understand, are my carb restrictions, are they coming from information that a nutritionist, a blog, whatever told me? Or are these actually coming from my body's signals? Because I know people who truly can't tolerate carbohydrates. Okay. And I've worked with individuals to help them with this, and a lower carbohydrate diet truly just is what works best for their body. Okay. So I recognize that, and I have a background in functional medicine. I understand the science behind these things as well. But I really want to talk about and tap into your mindful and intuitive eater and recognize if your truth came from diet culture, if it came from your body, because we want it to come from the body, right? So the first thing that we need to do is to identify this. And then there's this whole concept in intuitive eating that we want to honor our hunger and actually give ourselves unconditional permission to eat carbs. Unconditional permission to eat the carbs. This statement brings people a lot of anxiety when I tell them to do this, and it does take, at a certain stage as we're working together, I'll invite them to try to unconditionally eat a particular food that they may have been avoiding because it's high in sugar, because it's high in carbs, whatever it is that they're fearing. Could be a different macronutrient as well, could be fat, Rarely do I see people afraid of protein, but whatever it is, giving yourself unconditional protein or permission to eat the food. This is huge. This is actually really, really important. And what that does, and it doesn't always happen immediately because trust takes time to build, but what that does is it takes away that restrictive deprivation mode that actually amplifies our tendency to feel out of control around carbohydrates. So once you remove and you give yourself unconditional permission to eat, it's like your body says, okay, I got this. I can eat all the donuts I want. Like, what? And what I encourage you to do with that is then with intention, right? Sit down at the table. Try not to eat these carbs standing or walking out the door in the car. That distraction piece is a part of mindful eating, of mindful eating practice. However, have the food intentionally with mindfulness, taste the food, smell the food, see the food. Use all your different types of hunger to really immerse yourself in the enjoyment of the food and just witness what happens when you give yourself that unconditional permission to eat. I observe this a lot with my daughter, who I have to admit is difficult sometimes to give her unconditional permission to eat, let's say a birthday cake or a plate of cookies. But it's amazing every time I put like a bowl of ice cream, and I always serve dessert with dinner, like, or with a meal, as just part of the meal. It's just like another option she has on her tray, and I don't make a big deal out of it. It's like there's green beans, there's chicken, and there's ice cream. It's like there's just three different kinds of foods. Okay, um, and Samantha, I'll get to your question in just a second. Sometimes they're a little bit delayed, so I will get there once I've kind of wrapped this little piece up. So I give her those things, and I'm always surprised. She'll take a bite of the ice cream immediately, and then she'll go eat the rest of her chicken, her green beans, and then just a couple more bites of her ice cream, and then she'll be done. And I'm always like, for adults who have been immersed in diet culture, it's like, okay, I'm going to eat the ice cream first because again, it's sourced from that space of deprivation, thinking that we can't, quote unquote, have that food. I observed this for myself as well when I started giving myself unconditional permission to eat certain things. I really observed that my craving for those things really went away. Like, I certainly still have sweet cravings. I indulge, but quite often I'm surprised at how little of the food I need to really pacify that craving in the moment. And it's usually much less than what I would have eaten in the past under that restricted space. So you can also I always encourage people to keep a food journal just to write down kind of the thoughts, emotions, and beliefs that are coming up when you indulge and allow that unconditional permission to eat. And if you are looking at from a nutrition perspective, if you are a little worried about carbs, maybe you do have blood sugar regulation issues, like some type of prediabetes or diabetes, and you are like giving yourself unconditional permission to eat ice cream shake or whatever could quite frankly like bump your blood sugar up and cause problems for your health. Like, this is a different conversation, right? This is not a conversation about medical nutrition therapy, but I want to address it because so many people have blood sugar regulation issues, lots of highs and lows. And so if that is a concern of yours, just ensure that you're pairing your carbohydrate intake, whatever it is, simple or complex, with protein and fat. And that helps blunt or slow down the entrance of blood sugar into your digestive system, so it can help mitigate or minimize that impact of blood sugar if you do have or somebody who has a problem regulating your blood sugar. So again, just keep this in context. This is general information. I'm not giving you guys dietary advice here, but I'm giving you guys some general outlines. So this idea of unconditional permission to eat can be really scary. Samantha asked, I'm interested about the links between sugar, carb cravings, and stress. Absolutely. Okay. So from an evolutionary standpoint, Samantha, when we have heightened stress in our body, we release certain hormones that can actually initiate like a desire for sugar. Because when we're in, if you think about like our ancestors, okay, let's just use like a primal example of somebody getting chased by a wild animal. If you think about the most constructive fuel source for fight or flight, and that's when the sympathetic nervous system's turned on, also related to stress. Stress leads to sympathetic nervous system. That's our fight or flight response. When we are under that, we need access to immediate energy. Okay? We need access to immediate energy, and the most immediate energy source available is carbohydrates, ideally simple sugars. This is why athletes use, Gatorade and those little gels and squeezy packets, because they're simple sugars, right? And they're quickly and easily turned into energy for the body. And so somebody under stress response, we don't know the difference between running away from a tiger and being stressed because our boss is, driving us crazy, or our spouse is, whatever the stressor is coming from. Our body still acts physiologically in the same way. So we have this like instant way of needing sugar. Like sugar helps take care of the energy we need to deal with the stressor. That's one way to look at it. The other thing to look at is that sometimes we use food, particularly highly palatable foods, high in sugar, fat, and salt, to soothe when we're feeling stressed. So this is kind of getting into emotional eating, but since you asked the question, I'll address it here. But there's this component of, eating to numb the stress, right? So I do this even to this day. Okay. There's nothing wrong with emotional eating. I still do it and I feel no shame or guilt about it, but I might be working on a project, putting some notes together for a Facebook Live and feeling like, oh, stressed. And I might find myself walking out to the kitchen and looking for a cookie. Okay. This again happens to me to this day. And I get an opportunity in that moment to be aware and be like, okay, is it really sugar that I need? Is it sweets that I need? Or can I cope in another way? And there's other ways to cope with stress that I'm sure you're aware of. If you're listening to this, that's all part of the mindfulness practice. Deep breathing, we can go for a walk, call a friend, whatever. There's different ways to cope with stress, but that oftentimes kind of our neurobiology, we've been kind of conditioned to use food as a numbing agent. So it's another perspective. And sugary sweet things can just be an easy way to instantly raise dopamine in our brain, which is a feel-good hormone in the face of stress. So food that tastes yummy can be a source of comfort, also a source of numbing. So we could deconstruct that a bit more, but I'll keep it there. If you have other questions, Samantha, pop them in the chat for sure. But there's, a couple different ways of looking at that and identifying what is kind of true for you. So I hope that this live was helpful. I've really enjoyed jumping on here and just sharing a little bit. I like to keep my lives under a half hour. So I'm going to end this here, but I'd love to get your comments and your ideas around this, because I think that there's so much, there's nuance that comes into this, right? This is just basic information. There's definitely nuance and personal experience, lived experience. But I want you to ask yourself, where did you learn carbs were bad? And does it come from your body wisdom, or does it come from diet culture? Because body wisdom can tell us that sugar doesn't feel good in our body, for sure. Like I experience this all the time. Like if I have something too sweet, I feel nauseous and sick, right? And so I stop eating it, or, or I try to replace, certain meals I have. I'm particularly interested in getting a lot of protein and fat because I know that carbs don't make me feel good at that particular time of the day. So this is about discovering your inner nutritionist too, right? And it takes time. It does. It can take time because we have to unlearn a lot and relearn to listen to our body. So just a quick invitation, if you guys are interested in this work, if you're kind of jiving with my message, you feel drawn to connecting with me on a deeper level, my schedule is a little limited this week, but I do still have a couple openings for food freedom strategy calls. It's an opportunity to hop on the phone with me, see if working together makes sense, and kind of hear a little bit more about you and what's going on for you, so I can give you some resources to support your relationship with food and body and help you create more peace with that. So never any pressure, but I'll pop the link into the chat box after I get off this live if anyone's interested in setting that up. Next week is actually a little more open for me, but I do have a couple appointments left this week as well. So I think that's it, my friends. I hope you have an awesome Monday. You had a great weekend, and we'll chat soon.